Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are beginning episode 3 in the All the President's Men series, specifically related to the E. Howard Hunt character that the public came to know during the Watergate fallout. We left off in the last episode. The unthinkable has happened. All of the plans that Nixon and the CIA had been making in in partnership with the mob, as we learned in yesterday's episode, and also the Cubans who worked for the mob, was under the pretense that Nixon was going to win the '60 election and everything would continue uninterrupted. And of course, Nixon did not win that election. Everything was interrupted. And from '60 to '68, Nixon was out of power. And when the Watergate burglary takes place and we start to see the subsequent fallout, of course, Nixon, we don't know about this at the time, but we find out later we start listening to the tapes, that in real time, Nixon was extremely concerned because 4 of the 5 burglars were Cubans, and he had a background with those Cubans, as we learned yesterday, to the creation of a secret assassination team that Santos Trafficante had put together for him. And of course, the purposes originally were to assassinate Castro before the election. But that didn't occur, and Nixon lost power. And for 3 more years, the assassination team was trained and paid and didn't melt away until late '63, after the JFK assassination. And because Nixon had been the one who put that together, he was extremely paranoid that it was going to get out, because 4 of these 5 burglars, if you trace them back, had their roots with Nixon and the CIA. He called them the Bay of Pigs guys. And he was always talking about the Bay of Pigs. And of course, we learned yesterday that that was code for the JFK assassination, because they had been trained assassins uh, upon the request of Richard Nixon, who was vice president. He put that secret assassination team together. And we know he's concerned about who shot John, because he met with Richard Helms, the CIA director, asked for the Bay of Pigs file, which Helms thought at the time meant the real Bay of Pigs, but of course was explained to him through the course of that conversation. Nixon really meant the who shot John angle. He's talking about the JFK assassination. Of course, this is corroborated later by Bob Haldeman in testimony for the Senate Watergate Committee when Sam Ervin asks him, what does he mean by Bay of Pigs? Haldeman said he's talking about the JFK assassination. Nixon was paranoid that any investigation of the 4 Cubans would lead back to Santos Trafficante and this S-Force, and of course, eventually a discovery that they had been put together, this assassination team had been put together through the efforts of the vice president. He was also concerned about the presence of E. Howard Hunt among the 7 who were arrested. And he said so. He's in his comments on the tapes, he said he's the lever, he's the key. That's a scab. If you pick that scab, it's going to uncover a hell of a lot of things. He was very concerned about the check that they found in Bernard Barker's pocket, bank account in Mexico City, and how this would, here we are in '72, '73, '74, but that account had been in place since '59 and '60, when Nixon, with the help of a few private individual friends of his, put together this assassination team and logistically made efforts to create a way to pay them using this bank account, an attorney down in Mexico City, using a home of Clint Murchison to train them. Of course, this was all done by the CIA, over which Nixon was in charge as chairman of the 5412 committee. Anyway, the three things he was extremely concerned about was that that FBI was going to investigate this check, was going to investigate these very sensitive covert projects further south of the border, was going to investigate E. Howard Hunt, and his whole assassination team is going to blow up in his face. And this is 72 when the burglary happened. It's an election year. He is extremely, nowhere in the tapes does he even mention Watergate, the burglary. He's concerned about the past. He's concerned about what happened back when he put this assassination team together, this S force. Of course, the reason he's concerned is because when he lost power, he lost control over that S force, the whole process. And he knows what Santos Trafficante knows. He's afraid the American people are going to know that this S force changed targets. And the very training they were receiving, hitting a moving target from distance with high-powered rifles between three triangulated shots or three triangulated positions with teams set up is exactly how JFK was assassinated in Dallas 3 years later. And so what he knows and what Santos Trafficante knows and is telling his attorneys is, and we haven't got to that part yet, but we will, is that this assassination team, this S force, which was originally constituted to kill Castro, changed targets because of the actions of the new president, because of events that took place between 61 and 63 that made the national security apparatus, primarily the CIA, realize that they were never going to get their war with Cuba that they wanted. They were never going to get to assassinate Castro or overthrow his government unless they got rid of Kennedy first. And we'll go through that. We're going to go through today some of the events in 61 and 62 that lead these people to that conclusion. And of course, they have an active assassination program already going. It's ongoing. Two of them, actually. Executive Action is targeting foreign heads of state. ZR Rifle is targeting American heads of state or American targets. They have a group that's already training to carry out this assassination. So it's very easy just to change targets, use all the same methods, use all the same processes, use all the same people. And then when that mission is accomplished, and of course, you're going to be very careful to set it up in such a way, make it look like it's a false flag, right? Make it look like the Cubans were behind it, the assassination of JFK or the Russians, so that it'll inflame the American people in such a way that they'll get that war that they've always wanted with Cuba. And that's how they'll take care of Castro. So it's a sinister plot, but it's a brilliant plot. They had a lot of moving parts. Simultaneously, they were preparing for the actual event itself, while at the same time preparing a patsy. And while at the same time preparing a successor who would cover everything up. The important thing was that all these perpetrators would never face justice. They would never face any sort of legal liability for their actions. They would get away with it. And all the blame would be shifted to this poor, hapless asset the CIA was preparing in advance. So that's a lot to kind of put together in an introduction here, but kind of want you to know where we're going and why Nixon is so paranoid. Now, this was the million-dollar question. I remember in college, we were talking about Watergate, and on its face, it made no sense. He was cruising to a victory. Why would he be so reckless, talking about Nixon? And even my professor could not answer that simple question, why? Because a lot of this wasn't known in 1994, 95, when I was taking that class. You know, a lot of this has come out subsequent. Some of it was known, but not publicly. And it's just been through a lot of research For example, my knowledge of all the ZR rifle details uh, has only recently been expanded because of a book by Mary Haverstick, which came out, I think, this year or possibly last year. Where the knowledge base is always expanding based on research done by these researchers. And you read the book and you learn, and it's another puzzle piece, or maybe it's several puzzle pieces. So, but Nixon knew all this. And of course, Richard Helms knew all this, and Vernon Walters knew all this, which is why when he speaks in code to Bob Haldeman and Ehrlichman, says, go to these people, go to the CIA, go to um, Richard Helms and Vernon Walters, and tell them that this is going to open all the Bay of Pigs stuff. It's going to, any investigation of the Bay of Pigs guys is going to reopen all the Bay of Pigs stuff. And of course, Haldeman's confused. He says, well, they got to know what that means. I don't know what that means. What's that mean? And he goes, oh, yeah, they'll know what that means. And because they're all speaking the same language, they all have the same things to hide. And it's a pressure point, it's a leverage instrument. So that's where we are. And the new president is inheriting all of these covert operations that Nixon has set in motion as head of the 5412 committee during his time as vice president from 52 to 60. And of course, the big one is Operation Zapata, which we know as Bay of Pigs. And Nixon presumptively had thought he was going to win. Presumptively, he thought he was going to win. Everybody thought he was going to win. It was a big surprise when he didn't win. And so he had been planning this operation. Remember now, I gave you a little background on this. And the background is that Nixon had met with, after the revolution and after Castro had overthrown our guy, Batista, he'd met with him and he'd given him an ultimatum. He'd said, as long as you don't have any relations, any diplomatic relations with the Soviets, things can continue as they were. And of course, Castro got his back up and says, you're not going to tell me who I can have diplomatic relations with. You're not going to tell Cuba. You're not going to infringe on Cuba's sovereignty that way. And so that immediately put the United States and Castro, the new government in Cuba, at odds. And so immediately, Nixon goes to 5412 committee and says, okay, we got to get rid of this guy. We got to do in Cuba what we've already done in Iran and Guatemala. So they began planning this overthrow of the Cuban government, Castro, by this U.S.-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs. And of course, it doesn't happen. A lot of things didn't happen for Nixon in the timing that he was desiring. The assassination of Castro didn't happen quickly, at least not in time to help him in the 60 election, take credit. The Operation Zapata, it took time to train these Cuban refugees. And of course, he's planning on winning anyway, so it doesn't really matter if it happens before or after. And so the plan was for it to happen in March or April, the following spring after the election. Well, of course, he didn't win the election, so now it's JFK who's got to make the call. And the CIA comes to JFK and they lay it out. And of course, they present it in such a way that looks like a slam dunk. They said, you know, we've got these trained mercenaries, these Cuban refugees that are motivated to go in. And all we got to do is, you know, they have weapons. We've trained them. It's an army. It's a Cuban army, basically. We'll drop them off. And once they start the invasion, we'll jump in and declare our intentions to help them. But it'll look like this was a homegrown revolution started by Cubans, that we didn't have anything to do with it. We're just coming in after the fact to support them. This is all subterfuge. Everything's directed by the Americans. They're trained in Miami. and other places, New Orleans, places like in the South. Uh, all their weapons come from the Americans. Their transportation's coming from the Americans. Everything's coming from the Americans and the CIA. And all their people in charge are American personnel, CIA personnel. E. Howard Hunt's one of them. Frank Sturgis, another Watergate burglar, was involved. Um, so anyway, the whole point of it was to try to rally support amongst the Cuban people. If you can land this force on Cuban soil, what they told JFK was, we think, according to our intelligence, that the Cuban people don't like Castro. And as soon as they see this landing army, they'll join in the cause and they'll overthrow Castro. And it'll look like it was all homegrown. And then we can go in and clean up the mess and reconstitute our American-friendly government there in Cuba. That's the plan. But it was going to be easy peasy. That's what the CIA promised JFK. JFK is young. This is his first foray into foreign policy, basically. And later he regrets this, but he goes ahead and he greenlights this operation. And, I think as a young president, he's probably deferring in his mind to the previous president. And who wouldn't? When you're a young whippersnapper and your predecessor was Dwight Eisenhower, a war hero, a certifiable war hero, an actual war hero. And JFK is a war hero too. But, he was one of the grunts. Eisenhower was one of the generals. And so if this was okayed by Eisenhower, then far be it from him to stand in the way. Now, he probably won't greenlight anything going forward, but this is residue from the previous administration, and everyone around him is pressuring him to okay it, so he does. This will be the last time he does that. You can kind of see Kennedy going forward as he develops his sea legs, and he starts off a little wobbly, a little deferential, and to the generals and to the previous administration, to the CIA, etc. But boy, he learns quick. He's a quick learner, and he grows a spine. And as long as he's wobbly, he's useful. But when he grows a spine, he starts standing up to all this, he becomes a threat to these same people. Anyway, we all know how it went. We won't relitigate Bay of Pigs. It was an unmitigated disaster. A lot of people say, well, it's because Kennedy didn't order the air support. Kennedy had authorized air support. That's one of the big misnomers of this whole thing. But they fucked it up. There was a time change, and some of the air support was supposed to come from Guatemala and or Nicaragua, actually. And they got the timing wrong. They came in an hour late, and the Bay of Pigs thing was already over. And then they came to him and said, well, we want more air support. He wouldn't authorize more. He authorized enough for the operation, but they screwed it all up. Anyway, they end up captured, as you see here in this picture. Another part of the story that a lot of folks didn't realize, and CIA underestimated, was Castro's ability to know what was coming. He had spies in Miami. He had spies all around. He knew the time, he knew the day, he knew the location. He was waiting for him. It was an absolute ambush, is what it was. Total clusterfuck. And of course, Kennedy, this is April. I remember the date because it happened on my birthday, April 17th. And he's brand new president. And everyone's kind of taking a chance on him because he's young and inexperienced. And in his first foray into a foreign intervention, it's a flop on the world stage, and America looks weak, looks ridiculous. JFK looks weak, looks ridiculous. And there's a lot of buyer's remorse amongst a lot of folks at this point about this new president. Didn't look like he's up to the job. Meanwhile, Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, is upset because Cuba is their proxy, an ally. And here in the United States of course, he knows what's going on. He knows what happened. He knows the Americans are behind this, in spite of all our efforts to make it look like we weren't. And he's upset about it. And you got this new American president who's already stepped on the toes of our Cold War enemy. And so JFK hurries to promise Premier Khrushchev that he's not going to back any future U.S.-backed incursions into Cuba. He's got egg on his face. And he's trying to save himself and save what's left of his presidency and save the peace. Um, at this point, JFK, as he rehashes this in his mind, JFK, like a man, takes all the blame. He stands there in a press conference and he says, I'm the responsible officer of government. And he takes all the blame publicly, but privately, he's very upset with the CIA because he realized now he's been lied to by the CIA. And this isn't the first time. During the campaign, the CIA lied to him during their briefings, and they told Kennedy that there was a missile gap, that the Soviets had more missiles than we did. And Kennedy ran out and campaigned on that. And it scared the American people. What's this Eisenhower Nixon government doing, letting the Russians pass us and make more missiles than we have? It put us, at least the American people thought, we were at a disadvantage. If there was ever a nuclear confrontation between the two countries, we would lose because the Soviets would outgun us. It wasn't true. It's a lie. But it put Nixon in a box because he couldn't refute it. He couldn't argue back. That's not true because it's classified. He can't reveal classified information. And he's the one that would be in the position to know. So if he refutes it, he's giving away a secret, a classified secret. Nothing that Kennedy was saying was giving away a secret. He's just making an accusation. People just assume he's, he knows what he's talking about, but he's not giving numbers. He's just saying we don't have as many as they do. So Kennedy was free to say what he wanted. Nixon was bottled up and couldn't respond. Of course, Nixon's very upset that the CIA would do this to him. This is part of the paranoia of Nixon. He realized that the CIA had taken a side in the '60 election. And I've always wondered about that because the CIA was getting everything it wanted from Nixon. Why would they take a side and support Kennedy? And what it comes down to is they made a decision that Kennedy was so malleable once he believed this lie, they felt like they could basically tell him anything and he would okay anything that they said or wanted or asked for. Nixon, on the other hand, knew where all the bodies were buried. Nixon knew everything. They couldn't lie to Nixon. So they made the bet. They bet that they would be better off with Kennedy for 4 years because he would be easy to push around. And a lot of that's based on the fact that, I'm not sure if they even thought he would believe the lie about the missile gap. But when he did, and he campaigned on it, they thought, wow, this guy's easy. We can control this guy. And so that's when Nixon realized the CIA was working against him in the campaign. But the second lie is now about the Bay of Pigs and how easy this was going to be. And Castro didn't have enough forces to respond, and the Cuban people were going to rise up and revolt. All these lie upon lie upon lie. And so publicly, he took the blame, but privately, he vowed to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. There's an old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. He's been fooled twice now by the CIA. Regarding that missile gap, once he became president, he started getting the accurate numbers. That's when he realized that the CIA had been lying to him during the campaign. So he is fully aware now. Kennedy kind of came into the office unaware, believing the CIA, believing the generals, and it turns out believing lies. Pretty quickly, he realized the lay of the land. These guys are lying to me. They want a war with Cuba. And later we're going to discover the generals wanted a war with the Soviets. Well, we had a nuclear advantage. Turns out we had a nuclear advantage, not a disadvantage. And they were prepared for millions of people to die just as long as we won that war. But we had to do it quick because the Soviets were building missiles quickly. And at some point, they're going to catch up. So there was a window of opportunity. So Kennedy's realizing all this. These CIA guys that are talking to me every morning, they want a war with Cuba. They want to get rid of Castro. And they're willing to lie to me to get that war. And these generals want a war with the Soviets. And they're willing to make me look bad in front of Premier Khrushchev and back us into a corner or back him into a corner where we end up in a war with each other. They're okay with that. And as president of the United States, he had to come to a point where he said, I'm not okay with that. And that meant he had to stand up to these people. So that's 3 months into his presidency. Also in 1961, we have a an attempted coup d'etat in France. They call it the Day of the Jackal. And the attempt was by French military officers to overthrow Charles de Gaulle because he's trying to make peace with a former French colony, Algeria, rather than support a war against Algeria. And they want a war. Sound familiar? It's the same thing. Here in America, the national security apparatus, this military industrial complex, this deep state, whatever you want to call it, they wanted a war with Cuba. They wanted a war with the Soviets. And they're lying to their president to get that war. And at any point, if he ever stands up to that, there's going to be hell to pay. Well, the only difference between what's happening in France and what's happening in America is that de Gaulle is several years further down the road. He's already standing up to his own military regarding this colonial war in Algeria. He's trying to settle it. He's trying to make peace. And so they want to get rid of him. And of course, the way to get rid of him is to assassinate him. And turns out that the CIA is working with these generals to assassinate the French leader. This has got the support of Allen Dulles and the CIA, which of course JFK knows nothing about this. This is one of those things they're not telling him. They're already proven that they'll lie to him. Why would they tell him this? He doesn't need to know this. This is how they work. When Nixon was their guy as vice president, head of the 5412 committee, they all worked together because Nixon was on their side. But pretty quickly they realized JFK, the less he knows, the better off. And so they're not telling him this stuff. That's why they didn't tell him half of what he needed to know to make a good decision about Operation Zapata, Bay of Pigs. And so they don't tell him anything about what they're doing in France, supporting these French military officers. By the way, this will all be corroborated. I'm not making a wild accusation here. We'll get to that in a second. But anyway, this plot involves a motorcade winding among high-rise buildings in a major French city, and they're gonna take him out in his car. Sound familiar? And that's again with the support of Allen Dulles and the CIA. Now, de Gaulle survives. You can see him in this open-top car here, and just like Dallas, it's almost identical to Dallas in the logistics and how this plot was going to be carried out. De Gaulle survives this assassination attempt and confronts the new president, the new American president, when he finds out who was involved in this. And when he realizes the Americans, the CIA and Allen Dulles were participating with these disloyal generals to assassinate him, he confronts President Kennedy. He says, why are you having the CIA participate in an assassination attempt against me? Initially, I think de Gaulle was accusing JFK and realized pretty quick JFK didn't know anything about it. And here's JFK in Dutch with another world leader almost immediately having to explain to him, I didn't back any such coup. I don't know anything about it, but I'm going to look into it. And after he did look into it and had his brother Bobby look into it, JFK has to go back to de Gaulle and admit, this is in writing, there's a document, they admit in writing that he's basically apologizing and saying, I'm clearly not in charge of my own CIA. I didn't authorize this. I didn't order this. I had no involvement in it. I had no knowledge of it. But what you say is true. I'm sorry. And this indicates to me that I am not in charge of my own CIA. So what Kennedy is realizing right quick is that the CIA has gone rogue. They've used him during a campaign, lied to him about a missile gap. They used him and lied to him about Operation Zapata at Bay of Pigs, trying to gin up a war with Cuba. And they hid from him this plot to overthrow or assassinate another world leader. And he realizes the CIA is running wild here. There doesn't seem to be any oversight. Who's in charge? It appears to him Allen Dulles is kind of carrying out his own foreign policy. independent of the president. Of course, that's the president's prerogative to set foreign policy. That's his job. It's one of his main jobs. And here's Allen Dulles usurping that. So this is what Kennedy is learning. And of course, it's embarrassing to say to another world leader that you don't know what your own CIA, a federal agency that you have control, or you don't know what they're up to. But he had to admit that. Meanwhile, remember now, he's made this promise to Khrushchev on his watch there's not going to be any more incursions into Cuba. But here he is still thinking, and he's made promises during the campaign to these Cuban population. He still thinks Castro's a bad guy. He still believes the government needs to be overthrown. He doesn't like the way Operation Zapata went. He doesn't like being lied to. But he's still not ready to stand up to the powers that be. He's still not ready. He's coming closer to being ready because he's learning things. He's keeping it to himself. And publicly, at least here within the national security apparatus, he reconstitutes Operation 40, which is all in an effort to overthrow Castro in Cuba. He just changes the name. He calls it Operation Mongoose because he'd made a promise to Khrushchev, and he wanted to appear, at least to Khrushchev, that he had honored that promise by shutting down Operation 40. Khrushchev has spies too. He knows what we're doing. And he knows Operation 40 is our efforts to destabilize Cuba, to overthrow Castro's government. And that's what he was upset about. And when Bay of Pigs happened, he knew that this was part of Operation 40. And so he confronted Kennedy on it. Kennedy said, oh, we'll never do that again. And he shuts down Operation 40. But he really doesn't shut down Operation 40. All he does is change the name. And he actually doubles down, tells the CIA, tells his brother, we're going to spare no expense. We're going to spare no effort to get rid of this guy, Castro. But he changes the name. He's trying to deceive. This is all for an audience of one. He's trying to deceive Nikita Khrushchev to convince him. He's playing the same game the CIA's playing. CIA's lying to Nixon, to Kennedy. Now Kennedy's lying to Khrushchev. And he'd made him a promise, and he wasn't keeping his promise. And so this is when the operation ramps up, or amps up. And you see the CIA create this big station down in Miami called JM Wave. This is on the University of Miami College campus. And you still have the 5 original Operation 40 bases that are operating, but JM Wave becomes the headquarters of this effort to destabilize and overthrow Cuba's government, possibly get rid of Castro. And of course, we know this all goes on between 61 and 63. It goes all the way up to his assassination. And, if you go to New Orleans and even Dallas in the months before the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferrie, all these guys are running around participating. Guy Bannister, Clay Shaw, they're all participating in Operation Mongoose. So this becomes an ongoing effort. Of course, we now know it failed miserably. Somewhere in that time, Khrushchev figures it out, and he's going to take measures to resist what he feels is a second invasion that is almost certainly coming. In the meantime, in his effort to cut the CIA off at the knees, Kennedy passes National Security Action Memos 55, 56, 57, and he strips from the CIA their ability to carry out large covert ops. Now, this is part of their 5412 committee function, and they've gotten used to it because under Nixon in the 50s, they're all around the world carrying out these large-scale covert ops with the blessing of the executive branch. As long as Nixon could make a case that this was to resist communism or communist expansion, he always got the okay, and everything was black ops, including the budget. Nobody knew how much money the CIA was getting for these 5412 operations, how much they were spending. Nobody knew anything. That's why I called Nixon the sort of the secret Svengali over the whole world. He's a runaway train, and the CIA was his runaway army, and they got used to that, and they liked that power. And here's this no, young whippersnapper president all of a sudden standing up to him, and he transfers the responsibility of covert ops, these large scale covert ops, to the Joint Chiefs. In other words, to the military. He takes away from the CIA and he gives it to the military, which is which is and the reason he did that is because the military, he's the commander in chief. He's over the military. In other words, they can't hide from him what they're doing because he is their boss. And so anything that the military is engaged in, covert or otherwise, he's going to know about. And he has control, or he can shut it down, or he can start it up. And the CIA, they've been hiding all kinds of stuff from him. They've been lying to him. So this was a way to ensure that he had his thumb on what the CIA was doing. No longer can they do large scale covert ops, just tiny little pinprick stuff, penny ante stuff that is beneath them. It's insulting to them. The big stuff, they like overthrowing governments. They like assassinating foreign heads of state. They like rigging elections. They like propagandizing entire nations, the big stuff. And now they can't do any of it. It's just infuriated the power structure of the CIA. But remember, this is what he said he's going to do after Bay of Pigs. I'm going to dash them into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds. He's taking away their power. He's giving it to the military, which is under his authority. All right, this was in June of '61. Remember now the Bay of Pigs happened in April. So this is just 2 months later, and he's taking steps. Now, publicly, he's playing a dual game here. He's learned how to play the game. Publicly, he's still supporting an operation to overthrow Castro and get rid of his government by supporting Operation Mongoose. But he's transferring all the power from the CIA guys to the Joint Chiefs people. And so publicly, he can at least say to Cuban people here in America, whom he made promises to during the campaign, yeah, I'm still working to get rid of Castro. Don't worry. We failed at Bay of Pigs. That was my fault, but we're still working on it. It's going to happen. But privately, he's taking the power away from the CIA. He's giving it to the military. And the CIA is not going to stand for this. Alan Dulles is not going to stand for this. All these guys that have been plotting this war, this was going to be a CIA war. All these guys have been plotting this war since '59 under then Vice President Nixon are now standing out there. If you ever watch that JFK movie, the Mr. X describes it this way. All these CIA guys are now standing out there with their dicks in the wind, and they're not happy. Everything they've been plotting and planning has now been taken away from them by this young whippersnapper president whom they thought they could control. But he's starting to show signs of a backbone. All right. In that same month, now remember, at this point in time, Khrushchev is operating under the assumption that Kennedy will keep his promise and leave Cuba alone. So they meet in Vienna. Of course, we all know Kennedy's not doing that. So they meet in Vienna for their first summit. And this is oftentimes just where you take the measure of your counterpart to see if this is somebody you can work with. Is this somebody you can negotiate with? Is this somebody you can bully? You can push around. And the suspicion that Khrushchev has is that already, having watched what happened at Bay of Pigs, JFK's in over his head. And this is a real opportunity for the Soviets to push the American leader around, make him look weak, and give the Soviets the leg up in this Cold War. So they meet, and Khrushchev comes on very strong. It was a plot. It was a plan. He came in. He knows the president is weak after Bay of Pigs, and so he thinks this is my opportunity to drive him into the ground. And he humiliates JFK. It was not much of a negotiation. He just browbeating and didn't give anything, showed no sign of weakness, no sign of negotiating, no sign of working together or forming any kind of a partnership, anything. He's pushing just to see if Kennedy has a line he won't cross. Kennedy even comes back afterwards and said, quote, he just beat the hell out of me. And We now know, because of research that has emerged, that Kennedy was sick and in a weakened state. He was having terrible back issues. He was on heavy doses of pain medication. He was very uncomfortable. They sat for long stretches in these meeting rooms, and he was in pain. And Kennedy was just miserable this entire weekend that they had this little summit. And then on top of that, you got this world leader, this guy who's been around. I mean, he got his training under Stalin. So he's a tough guy. And he's just beating the hell out of this new president. And Khrushchev goes back and tells his people. His son wrote a book about it later and said, it corroborates this, said that Khrushchev goes back and tells all his people back in Moscow that JFK's in over his head. And the calculation is made at that point, Soviet side of things, that if there's ever a time to push the Americans, this is it, especially when it comes to Cuba or Berlin, for example. And JFK goes back licking his wounds. And of course, the national security apparatus that is there and privy to everything that's going on in Vienna sees their guy getting handed an ass whooping by the other guy, the other side's guy. And when taken in context with what's already happened, how he already believed a lie during the campaign, how easily he was suckered, and how he got roped into Bay of Pigs and then it failed. And of course, they're blaming him for that failure. And now you got this Vienna summit. And it's looking quickly to this national security apparatus around Kennedy that he is not up to the job. The American people aren't at that point yet. But the national security apparatus, the military, the Joint Chiefs, the CIA, they have come to that point. Remember, I said this is the point at which the Soviets think if we're ever going to push the Americans, this is it. This guy can't stop us. He's too weak. He's in over his head. So almost immediately in August of 1961, the Soviets, who hated the fact Americans had a presence in Berlin, it was the bone in the throat of Soviets during the Cold War that we were in the middle of their sector of East Germany. Because if you look at Berlin, it's in the middle of East Germany. And they wanted us out. They'd tried earlier, Stalin had, with the blockade, and we airlifted and embarrassed Stalin, so he had to call off that effort. But they haven't given up their dream of getting the Americans out of Berlin. So what was extremely humiliating on a pretty much a daily basis to the Soviets was the fact that Berlin was an open city and the free side was next to the communist side, and people weren't leaving the free side to come to the communist side, but people were leaving the communist side constantly to go to the free side. And it was a public humiliation. They wanted it to stop. That's why they wanted the Americans out. If they can't get the Americans out, we'll just build a wall so those people can't continue to embarrass us on the world stage. So they start building this wall. This is a provocation. Of course, all of the military command structure around Kennedy and all of the intelligence around Kennedy, CIA, etc., advised him, you can't this is a provocation. You can't let this go. You have to respond to it. You got to stop the Soviets from building this wall. Well, JFK thinks if I respond to it, we'll get in a war over Berlin. I'm not prepared to get in a war with the Soviets, which would be a nuclear war, over the city of Berlin. And so he thinks about it, and he comes up with this ingenious solution. He tells everybody around him, he says, let them build the wall. They're quarantining themselves. We've been worried all this time that they were going to invade the free part of Berlin. Now they're building a wall, boxing themselves in. Plus, in the world of public opinion, we're all trying to win converts to our side. How many converts are they winning to their side when the world sees that they're building walls to keep their own people in? That doesn't look very good. You got to wall your own people in. We're not walling our people in. And so he says, I'm not going to do anything. Let them build a wall. Now, the Soviets interpret this as another sign of weakness. After Vienna, after Bay of Pigs, the Americans and the power structure around Kennedy interpret it the same way. They're saying this guy never misses an opportunity to back down. He genuflects. Every time there's a confrontation, he genuflects. He turns around and bends over and takes it and likes it, basically. And so you got frustration on our side amongst the military industrial complex, and the deep state, the military command structure, the Joint Chiefs, the intelligence community, CIA, they're all frustrated because this new president, it's only August of 61. He's only been president. He's only been in the office since January. So 8 months, and he's already lost at Bay of Pigs. He got creamed at Vienna, and now he's letting the Russians build this wall in Berlin. What's next? Well, what's next is he continues his little jihad against the CIA. Remember, he privately made that promise. I'm going to dash them into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds. He's already taken their covert powers away. Now he fires the top 3 CIA guys. Alan Dulles, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell. Richard Bissell had been in charge, basically, of Bay of Pigs. He was second in command behind Alan Dulles, the director. And of course, Cabell, we know later becomes he was involved in all of the covert stuff, and his brother was the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell. He fires them. Now, these were like sacred cows in the world of intelligence, not just here in America, but around the world. And to fire the top, it sent shockwaves. He just disemboweled the leadership structure of the CIA. And this was his way to send a message to the CIA: you're not in charge anymore. I've already taken away your power as far as covert acts are concerned, covert operations. Now I'm firing the top 3 guys. I'm replacing the whole leadership structure. So he's at war with the CIA, while at the same time, he, at least in their view, is backing down every time there's a confrontation between us and the Soviets. So then we fast forward to November of 61, and the president gives a speech out in Seattle at the University of Washington. And of course, the president's words carry a lot of weight, and sometimes they indicate future policy. So people pay close attention, including foreign leaders. And here is where Kennedy's starting to make his turn. He's starting to publicly get his sea legs and start to indicate to his countrymen here in America, but also around the world, what direction the rest of his presidency is going to go. And he's battling a mindset in America that we, America, are sort of omnipotent, and we can be omniscient and omnipresent. We can solve all the world's problems. We can impose on all the rest of the world an American system. It's sort of an arrogant position. And he's arguing in this speech for a little humility on the American side. Of course, he's inundated with it constantly by all the advisors around him who are constantly telling him, go to war, go to war, go to war. If they won't do what we want, use our weapons of war to bully the rest of the world. Use our economic might to bully the rest. And he's starting to see that the rest of the world is viewing America in a different light. We're no longer the city on a hill that everyone aspires to be. They resent us because we're so powerful and we have so much economic and military power, and we use it to bully people. And so in this speech, he says, quote, the U.S. is neither omnipotent nor omniscient. We are only 6% of the world's population. We cannot impose our will upon the other 94% of mankind. We cannot right every wrong or reverse each adversity. Therefore, there cannot be an American solution to every world problem. This is him saying, listen, I know there's problems out there, but we're not the world's policemen. And as long as I'm president, we're not going to act like it. We're only 6% of the world's population, and we're outnumbered. And we cannot solve every world problem, and nor will we even try. This is a message. He is sending a message to his national security apparatus. He's sending a message to Khrushchev. He's sending a message that America is no longer going to be in the business of rigging all these elections overseas, of assassinating foreign heads of state, of overthrowing governments, all the stuff he inherited that Nixon and Eisenhower had been doing. We actively overthrew governments in Iran and Guatemala. We were trying in Cuba. The plot to assassinate Charles de Gaulle in France. I mean, we got our hands in a lot of pots And Kennedy's saying, we're not going to do that anymore. We can't do that. We got to deal realistically with our standing in this world and who we are. And this did not go over well. It indicates, I think, when you look at the totality of the Kennedy presidency, you start to see him growing a spine. And he's starting to publicly stand up. Privately, he's already at war with the CIA. But publicly, up to the speech at Washington, he had basically agreed to continue to go after Castro through Operation Mongoose. And so he's trying to play two games. Well, then we get to the end of 1961. He gives a speech at Washington, and it indicates that he's not going to play two games anymore, or at least he's on the cusp of it. We get to 1962, and in a meeting with the CIA and the Joint Chiefs, they bring to him this operation they called Operation Northwoods, which was a plan to commit basically false flag operations, state-sponsored acts of terrorism on American soil and against its own citizens, and blame Cuba for it. They're going to set up the Cubans to make it look like they shot up U.S. schools. We're going to set up Cubans to make it look like they crashed an American jet. We're going to set up the Cubans to create some sort of disaster within the NASA program that would result in the death of an American hero, John Glenn. This is all on documents. They lay it out, all these different scenarios that would gin up the American public opinion against the Cubans and justify a war. And it would all be false. It'd all be fake. The whole thing is subterfuge. It's fraudulent. One of the ideas, and I've given some of the documents here, some of the red boxes indicate some of these ideas. One was to blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. And they even in the document cite the beginning of the Spanish-American War and how we did a false flag there when we blew up our own ship, the Maine, and blamed the Spanish for it. And it resulted in the American people supporting our first foreign war and fighting the Spanish. And eventually, as a result of the Spanish-American War, we got all these colonies that used to belong to Spain because we won the war. We got the colonies, and it created a taste in our mouth for war and all the goodies that you can get from war. Anyway, the important thing to remember about this is, as they indicate in their own document, to remember the Maine, which the American people had been told the Spanish blew up our ship. Turns out we blew up our ship and killed our own people. It was a false flag, an effort to turn public opinion in support of this war. And it worked. And they cite that as an example that this has worked before. It'll work again. All we got to do is blow up a U.S. ship, blame the Cubans. And just like we did when we blew up the Maine, we can get the war that we want. Another idea was to shoot down hijacked American planes or gun down and bomb civilians in Washington and Miami. They had one idea, which was to create a terrorist act in a shopping mall in Miami. Anyway, the president's sitting here listening to all this. This is the CIA. This is the CIA talking to him. The Joint Chiefs, they've gotten together. So what's happened is the CIA has lost its power because of National Security Action Memos 55, 56, 57. So now they've gone to the people who now have that power, and they've convinced the Joint Chiefs to go along with this. And of course, they've been working together all this time anyway, because every time they overthrew a government, or they always had the backing. When Iran was kind of iffy and Guatemala was kind of iffy and wasn't sure if the operations were going to work, they always went to Eisenhower and asked for the military to back them up. And the military, and they'd get that approval, and the military come back them up. So that's how it worked. The CIA would go in, cause the problem, and then they'd ask the president for support from the military, and the military come in and clean it up. So they always worked hand in glove. So here they are working hand in glove again, this time with respect to Cuba, and they want this false flag operation, Operation Northwoods, basically to engineer a situation where the blame for the terrorism would fall on Castro, would fall on Cuba, and that would force the American people's hands, which right now doesn't support a war in Cuba. This is a way it's a psyop. It's a psychological war against the American people and what they know about what's actually going on. And it's a way to gin up a war, like they had already tried and failed in the Bay of Pigs. This is their second effort to gin up this war. Okay. First time failed. And here they're presenting this idea to JFK. And Kennedy's like, this is freaking crazy. And in fact, he got up and he stormed out of the meeting. He says, and you guys call, and we call ourselves the human race. And he just walks out shaking his head. And at this point, I think he realizes, I can't trust anything these people say. They've shown their hand and who they are. They're nuts. They're so bloodthirsty. They want a war at any cost. They don't care. The results be damned. They don't care how many people die. They don't care. They just want a war. Now, obviously, he shoots down this plan. And so historians have long regarded this Operation Northwoods as an unfulfilled plot or a wet dream that the CIA and Joint Chiefs had that never happened, right? It was never consummated. But the question that I would have for you going forward, for all of us to think about, is perhaps it didn't go unfulfilled. Perhaps Dallas was the ultimate Operation Northwoods moment where, I mean, because think about what Operation Northwoods was. It was an act of domestic terrorism on an American target, and the blame would fall on Fidel Castro and the Cubans. Well, think about what happened in Dallas. It was an act of terrorism on an American target, the United States president, and the blame was quickly shifted to Lee Harvey Oswald, whom the CIA had set up as the patsy as a pro-Castro sympathizer. They had all his cover story ready to drop. They had evidence of him being part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, pictures, news footage of him handing out leaflets in New Orleans the summer before the assassination. They had evidence of him that they concocted, as evidenced by this photo. They said that was Lee Harvey Oswald, that middle photo there, in Mexico City, meeting with Cuban authorities at the embassy, also with Soviet authorities, including Kostakov, a Soviet assassination expert with the KGB. And it just paints this picture of Oswald in the months before the assassination, this pro-Castro guy who's already been to Russia, right? He's clearly a Marxist. He identifies himself, that news interviews. He's meeting with Cubans and Soviets in embassies in Mexico City 1 month before the assassination. And he even meets with a Soviet assassination expert and comes back a month later and assassinates the president. All of this points back to Cuba. All of this points back to the Soviets. And if they play their cards right, November 22, 1963 can kill, no pun intended, several birds with one stone. You can get rid of the problems you have. The problem you have here domestically, which is JFK. The national security apparatus is already viewing JFK as a threat to what they want, to their objectives. He's a threat to their plans. So you can get rid of him, replace him with somebody who's going to be easy to control, LBJ. And at the same time, blame the Cubans, blame the Soviets, and at least get a war with the Cubans, which you've been itching for all along. So I believe they got their Operation Northwoods moment. They just did it without his say-so. They said, okay, if you won't sign on to this, we'll go ahead. They've already proven they'll do this, right? They supported an assassination attempt, ironically, of the same exact logistics, right? Open top car and a motorcade surrounded by high buildings. And they just take that plan from France and transport it to Dallas, and they're going to set it up in advance to blame the Cubans, blame the Russians. We'll get the war. We'll get rid of the president. We'll get the war. And doggone it, he didn't sign off on Operation Northwoods. He stormed out of the meeting, called us all crazy. We'll see who's crazy. So I think November 22, 1963 is clear evidence of CIA. It's got CIA Joint Chiefs fingerprints all over it, because I believe this is Operation Northwoods against the will of the president, behind his back and targeting him. It's not targeting an American jetliner. It's not targeting John Glenn. It's not targeting a Miami shopping mall. It's not targeting an American ship in Cuba Harbor, in Havana Harbor. It's targeting the American president, and the American people will rise up. They'll be so infuriated when we start dropping this cover story that's been prepared in advance, blaming this guy who has ties to Cuba, blaming this guy who's already been to Russia, blaming this guy who just recently visited the Cuban embassy in Mexico City and the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, blaming this guy who, while at that embassy in the Soviet embassy, visited with the expert in assassinations from the KGB, and makes it look like they ordered this guy. He's their plant to come assassinate our president. And, you know, what kind of country are you if you let that happen and you don't stand up to it, you don't respond to it? It's going to put us into that. Well, Dallas was Operation Northwoods fulfilled, in my view. And then, but now, of course, that's not going to happen until 63. And then comes October of 62, the famous Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is where we learn that the Soviet premier is wise to what Kennedy had done when he lied and said, we're not going to do any more incursions into Cuba. I'm shutting down Operation 40. But Khrushchev has learned that all he's done is reconstituted as Operation Mongoose. And they have this big base down in Miami called JM Wave, and everything is ongoing. And so Khrushchev realizes, okay, he lied to me. So I'm going to put missiles in Cuba because I know a future invasion's coming. If I have missiles in Cuba, that will act as a deterrent to a future invasion. It also helps us geopolitically, as far as strategy is concerned, because we can now hit all these U.S. targets with our short-range missiles, which before we couldn't. The Americans always had the advantage. We had missiles in Turkey and Italy aimed at the Soviets, but they didn't have anything in our hemisphere aimed at us. Well, now we're even Steven, and this gives them a bargaining chip. And of course, we find out about it. Long story about the U-2 plane, and CIA just run. Boy, they can't wait to come to JFK with this intelligence. The Soviets are putting missiles in Cuba, and everyone starts telling them again, we got to, at the very minimum, we got to bomb the missile sites. But we really think this is justification. It's 90 miles off our shore. This is justification to invade the island. Again, ginning up, itching for this war. And the argument that they give to Kennedy, and boy, they surround him in the Situation Room and just harangue him and Bobby. You got to do this. This is a do-over. You failed in Bay of Pigs, but this is your do-over. How many times in life do you get a do-over? It's on a silver platter right in front of you. You have to invade or at least bomb the missile sites. And that's all the advice he got. And of course, we know what JFK did. He stood up to him. He says, no, we're not going to bomb the missile sites. I am not going to be responsible for causing a nuclear war between us and the Soviets. And he orders the quarantine, and there's this long standoff between us and the Soviets, and it ends up in the UN. Of course, the Soviets tried to lie and say, we don't have any missiles, and they didn't know we had pictures. And so they were shamed, kind of like Stalin was shamed when he blockaded Berlin. Here they are shamed again in front of the world. But they had lied, and they didn't have missiles when they did. And so eventually a deal is worked out through a back channel. This is when Kennedy starts ignoring all the people around him and all the channels that he normally goes through to negotiate the Soviets, and he begins negotiating with Khrushchev directly. And Khrushchev responds directly. And they begin trying to figure out a way out of this because Khrushchev doesn't want a nuclear war either. But they got to save face. Khrushchev has to, in front of his people, have a victory, or he's perceived as weak. Kennedy, after Bay of Pigs, also needs a victory. So they're trying to figure out, well, how can both of these world leaders come out of this looking like they won? And Kennedy initially offers Khrushchev a way out, says, if you pull out the missiles, we won't ever invade Cuba again, or we won't mess around. And Khrushchev says, well, wait a second. You promised me that before. You promised me that when you said you're going to shut down Operation 40. All you did is change it to Operation Mongoose. You're going to do better than that, big boy. And so Kennedy says, well, what if I pull the missiles that are aimed at you out of Turkey and Italy and give you a promise we'll never invade Cuba again? All you have to do is pull your missiles out. How would that sound? And Khrushchev thinks about it and says, that sounds great. And Kennedy says, well, here's the catch. The world can never know what I gave you. The world can only know what you gave me. I have to get reelected. You don't. You don't operate in a democratic system. You don't stand for election. I have to run for reelection. I got to have a victory under my belt after Bay of Pigs. And so the only thing that can become public knowledge is that you pulled your missiles out when I confronted you. The world cannot know what I gave you, which is a promise never to invade again, which is a commitment to pull our missiles out of Italy and Turkey. And Khrushchev says, okay, because privately he knows that his military and all the folks around him are going to know what he got from the Americans. He got two things and Kennedy got one. And they don't care what the public perception is. He doesn't have to run for reelection. And so he says, that's a deal. That's a sweet deal. I win this deal. I get two things, you get one. If that means that you get to go around and puff your chest and the world thinks that you stood up to me and I backed down, so be it. But we all know privately I won this interchange. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, you open the history books, you don't hear anything about the missiles in Italy and Turkey. You don't hear anything about the promise never to invade Cuba again. All you hear is that Kennedy stood up to Khrushchev and Khrushchev backed down. That's what the PR machine that goes out, the propaganda that went out to the American people. That's what I was taught all the way through college. But that's not the reality of it. And the folks around Kennedy knew, just like the folks around Khrushchev knew, that Khrushchev had won this deal. And the national security apparatus, which is already mad at Kennedy because he backed down, in their view, at Bay of Pigs. He got creamed at Vienna. He let the Russians build a wall through Berlin, right? He stood up to the CIA and took their power away and gave the covert operations to the military. He fired the top three guys at the CIA. And then when they conspired with the Joint Chiefs on Operation Northwoods, he laughed at them, walked out of the meeting, insulted them. And now here we are in the Cuban Missile Crisis, another opportunity to stand up to the Soviets, and he's back down again. He's back down again. And they're apoplectic. They're just beyond. You say, what's all this got to do with E. Howard Hunt? Well, now, remember now, E. Howard Hunt is smack dab in the middle of all these Operation 40 and then later Operation Mongoose activities. We already learned he was in charge of one of the Operation 40 bases at the Everglades. And then, of course, when it transitions to Operation Mongoose, he just transitions with it. Just like Frank Sturgis, these guys are part of what was set up by Nixon back in 59. And, of course, this S-Force, which was started in 59 and 60, is continuing during all this period of time trying to hit a moving target from distance between three rifles in a triangulated hit. And E. Howard Hunt's right smack in the middle of all this. Okay? So he's one of when I talk about the national security apparatus being upset with Kennedy, he's in that national security apparatus. Which is why 12 years later, when Watergate happens, Nixon's so paranoid about what the American people are going to learn about E. Howard Hunt because he knows E. Howard Hunt has been throughout from 59 on involved in this national security apparatus that is increasingly becoming hostile to its president, President Kennedy, and eventually took matters into his own hand to get rid of him. And E. Howard Hunt's right smack in the middle of all of it. So any discovery of what E. Howard Hunt's been doing is going to uncover all this other stuff that we learned subsequent, that we've learned since, but we didn't know at the time. All right. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK gives the order. This is when the CIA found out. This is when the Joint Chiefs found. This is when everybody found out, even the Cubans. He gives the order to shut down Operation Mongoose. And uh, there was a lot of resistance. These guys have been training and training and training in preparation for overthrow of Cuba, in preparation for a war with Cuba. They're furious and they disobey his orders. They continue to launch raids. Bill Harvey, for example, launched a raid that sunk a Soviet ship right on the heels of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans sunk without the permission of the president. It's kind of like France all over again, trying to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. Americans sunk a Soviet ship in Havana Harbor. Could have caused a war. When Bobby found out about it, he goes to JFK, and they're furious. What on earth are these Lone Rangers doing? They don't think they answer to anybody. And so he had to send, he couldn't trust the military, couldn't trust the CIA. He didn't know who he could trust. So he sends down the Marshal Service to burn out some of these bases, to shut them down and arrest these CIA liaisons that are in charge leading these raids against Cuban targets in violation of the Neutrality Act, which says you can't do this when we're not at war with the country. You can't just target foreign countries or foreign governments if we're not at war with them. And so two of the prominent arrests that were made in November of 62, one was E. Howard Hunt and another was Frank Sturgis for violation of the Neutrality Act. Now, they didn't hold him for very long, but this was a message. This is a shot across the bow. You're not in charge, and we know what you did. And this is also a message to Khrushchev. I'm getting control of things here. And I told you this time I would shut down Mongoose. I'm shutting down Mongoose. There's some residue here I have to deal with because this thing predates me. It's been around forever. And they're trying to create this war. I think he probably communicated that to Khrushchev. In fact, Khrushchev's son said so, that Khrushchev realized there were hardliners in Kennedy's government, just like there were hardliners in his own government that wanted a war. And so don't rush to misinterpret something when it might not be Kennedy who ordered this attack on the Soviet ship. It might not be Khrushchev who orders something. It might be these hardliners trying to goad us into a war. Anyway, he shuts down these bases. He arrests E. Howard Hunt. He arrests Frank Sturgis for violation of the Neutrality Act. A month later, literally the day, right before the new year ticks over, he goes down to the Orange Bowl in Miami. And you can see all these this is like the epicenter of all things Cuban, the Cuban community down there. And here you see him posing with the flag of the brigade, the Cuban brigade, which is the Cuban refugees that went into Bay of Pigs. Most of them got captured. A lot of them got killed. And he's being presented this flag by these veterans of the Bay of Pigs. They've been returned. The ones that were captured, they've been returned by this point. And they presented him with this flag. And he announces to all the Cubans that are in attendance there at this Orange Bowl, someday this flag will fly over free Havana. And they're all cheering, yay. He's still trying to have it both ways. He's still trying to keep the Cuban community on his side. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, he's shutting everything down. He's taking the power away from the CIA, giving it to the Joint Chiefs. He's firing the top three guys at the CIA. He refuses Operation Northwoods. He refuses to offer the military support that they were so used to getting when an operation was on the brink of failure at Bay of Pigs. He refused to give it like Eisenhower had given it in Iran and Guatemala. Then he refused to invade or bomb the missile sites at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so it's very clear what Kennedy's objective here is now. He's about peace now. And he's honoring his promise to Khrushchev now to try to bring about peace. But he's still making a promise that he can't keep. He knows he can't keep to these Cuban people here at home. And he's counting on the fact that they won't be any wiser. And when he runs for re-election in 64, they'll still vote for him. And then if they figure it out later, who cares? He's a second-term president. He doesn't have to run for re-election. So he brings his wife. He knows this is going to be a tough sell. And every time Kennedy needed sympathy in front of a possibly hostile audience, he always brought his wife with him. Otherwise, he went by himself. And there's a long story about his behavior when he go on these trips by himself, and how his behavior had to change radically when he brought his wife. But no one hated Jackie. And you can see here these people, these down in the bottom picture, these are Bay of Pigs veterans that have all the reason in the world to hate JFK, their commander in chief, because he sold them out, Bay of Pigs. He sold them out to Cuban during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But they're smiling. Why? Because Jackie's there. And so it's a very tense deal. But his words, "This flag will be returned to the brigade to free Havana," reassures the Cuban people down in Miami, at least publicly, at least for a period of time, that he's still on the side of overthrowing Castro and his government. He's got a spotty record, and he's missed some opportunities, but he's still saying all the right things here at home. But his actions show Khrushchev a completely different side. His actions show the national security apparatus around him a completely different side. His actions show a guy that's grown a spine, is standing up to the national security apparatus here, standing up to the hardliners in his own government here, arresting people like E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, who continue to wage war against the Cubans, against the law, illegally, without his knowledge. So he has them arrested. His actions show that he has turned a corner. His words are still saying, "Hey, we're still in support of a free Havana," which means no Castro. But his actions show otherwise. And so that's where we are at the end of 1962. There is a silent war going on within the Kennedy administration between all the national security apparatus, which is when you think about a definition for the deep state, it's the national security apparatus and all the corporations that feed it. So you got all that, the deep state. You got this intelligence community and CIA specifically, and they're at war with Kennedy because they see what he's doing. They hear what he's saying, and they know that's all poppycock. That's all politics. That's all that is. They watch what he's doing, and he has become a threat to their plans. Before he became president, their plan was to gin up a war with Cuba. Their plan was to cause a war with the Soviets. The Doomsday Plan. The Joint Chiefs actually spelled it out to Kennedy. Right now, we have the nuclear advantage. If we go to nuclear war with the Soviets, yes, we'll lose several million people, but we'll win. We'll destroy them in the process. It's another time he got up, stormed out of the meeting. My God, you guys are animals. He's not listening to them anymore. His actions show he's all about peace. He had opportunities to go to war with the Soviets or with the Cubans. He's had two, and he's turned them both down. He had opportunity to stand up to the Soviets in Berlin, but he knew that would cause a war, so he didn't. He had opportunity to gin up a war through Operation Northwoods, but he refused. He's had all these opportunities, and he has steadfastly refused. Meanwhile, he's taking power away from the CIA, which they resent terribly. The 50s were their heyday, and now in the 60s, they're getting reined in. They don't like that. He fires the top three guys. He puts the power of covert ops in the hands of the military, over which he's commander-in-chief, or of which he's commander-in-chief. So 61 and 62 are setting the stage for 63. The Rubicon has been crossed. And he is surrounded like Julius Caesar. And I think Oliver Stone does a beautiful job of illustrating this in this movie. And Mr. X is talking about how Kennedy is surrounded like Julius Caesar by senators and congressmen, people that are respectable, people that are honorable, so-called, but on their face publicly, but behind his back, they're plotting his demise because he's standing in the way of their agenda. And one of these guys who is their operators, one of these operators that's involved in all of these machinations and knows how all of this is going from the inside perspective, is E. Howard Hunt. Now, today was a lot about backstory and things that were going on, events bigger than E. Howard Hunt, etc. But I promise this is all going to come back, and you're going to see why Nixon, when Watergate blows up, and two of the guys arrested are E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, the same two guys that he had arrested when they were waging their private war against Cuba from Everglades, and I believe it was No Name Key. And these are true believers in the cause, in the fight against communism. These are true believers in the national security apparatus to overthrow Castro, gin up a war with Cuba, and possibly even a war with the Soviets. And they know from the inside the turning of this plot, which originally was the S-Force assassinating Castro. They know from the inside the turning of this targeting away from Castro and to Kennedy. And what I'm trying to do is explain the reasons why that operation got turned, why the target changed. So I am big on backstory. It's so frustrating sometimes the way history is taught and how we focus on the event itself and know how and ignore the events that led up to that event and how it caused or contributed to it. So what I'm trying to do is build to a point where you can see why all of a sudden Nixon is obsessing in the tapes about the Bay of Pigs guys. And the Bay of Pigs, which we know as the JFK assassination house, is code. And E. Howard Hunt being the lever, the key, the scab that if you uncover is going to uncover a hell of a lot of things, including a very sensitive covert project further south of the border. He's paranoid about this check, this Mexico City bank that's been paying this assassination team since 60, and all these other covert ops that E. Howard Hunt's been a part of, that Frank Sturgis has been a part of, that are ongoing, even during the time he wasn't president. They were ongoing, continuing up to and including Watergate, 72 to 73. So hopefully that is clear as mud. where we are now, we're at the end of 62. And in the next episode, we'll pick up at the beginning of 63, which of course is the pivotal year. And then we'll tie it all in to Watergate. The thread that runs through all of that is E. Howard Hunt from beginning to end. Thank you. Hope you have a great day, and may God bless.